Good to have each one here. If you have a Bible, you might go ahead and be turning over to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We'll look there in just a few moments. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This has already been mentioned. Our topic this morning is going to be the glory of the Lord's Supper, that which we've already taken part in this morning. And Chris mentioned, even if there are some visitors here this morning that may have some questions about anything that we do, I think it's also important for us, maybe who've been Christians for a long while, to think about why we do what we do and the significance of the things that we do, to be reminded of those things. And so I hope that we'll have some thoughts worthy of our time this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, I'd like to read a portion of this text that is familiar to so many of us. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 26. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. Some months back, I was having a conversation with another young man, and we were talking about a host of spiritual topics. And one of the things that came up was the topic of the Lord's Supper, and he said something along the lines of, I've just really been struggling lately to bring thoughts to the table pertaining to the Lord's Supper that are fresh and new. And he said, I feel as if I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel every time I get up and talk about the Lord and his death and all those things. And in the larger context of that conversation, he was implying that after having read passages like the one that we just read, 1 Corinthians 11, maybe going to one of the Gospels that either give instruction or command us to take of the Lord's Supper, what else can we do? What else is there to think about? Is this it, essentially? And what I gathered from that conversation is that the Lord's Supper had become just rote to him. It had become tradition. It had become mundane, monotonous, tedious. That mentality of scraping the bottom of the barrel should not be said about anything that we do in worship to our God, but certainly not the Lord's Supper. It should never be a place that we find ourselves. And yet, maybe on the same side of that coin, I do want to also recognize that maybe that's where you are this morning. Maybe you are in a position. What else is there to contemplate? What should I be thinking about? And so I hope that we can offer some thoughts this morning that will be beneficial. Because with anyone in this room, no matter where we are in our walk with Christ, I hope that we recognize that there is always room for growth. There's always room where we can do better in anything in our service to God. So when we approach the Lord's Supper, we should not be coming to passages like 1 Corinthians 11, and maybe you've heard it talked about this way. I haven't heard it talked about here in this way. But just the only point that we take away from 1 Corinthians 11 or any other passage with similar thoughts is, the Lord said to do it, and so that's what we're going to do this morning. And that's all we have to say. Now, I will mention a few times throughout, it's not that, it hasn't been said and that we don't need to do these things. But if that's all that we have to say, we might see where this becomes rote or this becomes mundane. We want to do much better than that. So what I want to spend a lot of time on this morning is the reason of why we partake. And again, you note takers, you have a field day with this. I don't know, this is twice in a row now that we've had this, so I'll have to figure that out. All the points up there for you. But first of all, the first point that I'd like to make is that we should not approach the Lord's Supper to just simply say, it says do it, and so that's why we're doing it. Now again, it does command us to do that. Not dismissing that, not neglecting that point. Not saying that's unimportant. But what I do want to emphasize again is that if all we see is a command and nothing else, if we don't see the purpose, the command, or the meaning behind the command, then there's been a lot lost there. We've been going through that sort of thought process in the auditorium class when we're studying, for instance, the tabernacle this morning. Was it arbitrary in all the things that God gave to His people to build the tabernacle, to put it up, to take it down? So much of that was to talk to them about the character of God, where God dwelt. We'll even talk about that some with the supper this morning. But notice in 1 Corinthians 11 here, Paul makes a connection with what we're talking about. He says there is an unworthy way in which you can take of the supper. That if you're just sitting there, consuming the bread, drinking the juice, and that's it, that would be an unworthy manner, wouldn't it? Again, we'll come back to this a couple times throughout, but when we partake of the supper, it should not be that we treat this as an occasion where we're just coming to check a box. Taken the bread, check. Drink the juice, check. I've done my duty as a Christian. That's what God told me to do. That's what I've done. What more is there to do? There's a lot more. Do you remember God's condemnation of His people in the book of Malachi? Where they asked the question, such an ironic, sad question, really. How have we defiled you? They say. How have we done this? And it's rather obvious if they would just open their eyes and their ears, because they had cut corners wherever they thought that they could in offering sacrifices to God, the lame, the sick, the blind, and all while saying, "Oh, what a weariness." And yet they say, "How have we defiled you, O God?" Isaiah 29 and verse 13, Jesus echoes this later in His ministry, but Isaiah 29 and verse 13, "This people draw near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment taught by men." Yeah, we may show up and we may eat the bread, we may drink of the fruit of the vine, we think we're good. We're good with God. I want to plead with you to not take the supper in that way. That is not what was intended. You notice also back in 1 Corinthians 11, one more element of partaking of the Lord's Supper. One of the things that we're doing when we're taking of it in verse 26 is that we proclaim the Lord's death. What does it mean to proclaim the Lord's death? Well, first of all, that phrase proclaim means to announce something. That's indicated just by the English word that we see there. To make it plainly known that we are remembering the Lord's death, we are proclaiming it, and what's the other element with that? We proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. So there's really two elements with that phrase. We are announcing the Lord's death is a recognition that Jesus did die, and through His death, what is He now doing? We sang about it this morning, didn't we? Victory. He reigns because of His death and His resurrection. And that's also what we're observing when we partake of the Lord's Supper, that He reigns as the rightful King in heaven. So taking the bread, it reminds me of His physical body that He offered willingly and through love. Taking that fruit of the vine reminds me of the covenant that I entered into when I was washed in His blood through baptism. And it further reminds me, this is important, that I need to be faithful to that covenant until death. It's not just when I was sealed with the covenant, that's it, and I can just, show up as a warm body on the pew and not really engage my mind. There's a lot more to it. If you go back to chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 10, this is much of what Paul has already talked about. In verse 14, we'll start with, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" So we can even see from that small portion of the text here, there's even a lengthier context of Paul talking about fellowshipping or abiding with demons, false gods, idols, or with the one true God. And there are ways in which you align yourselves to one party or the other, where you share fellowship. So when you offer things to idols, to demons, you share in demons. And he's going to go on to say, when you share, that is, you are in communion together, you are also in communion, share in the Lord's body. And that means that you share the blessings and the benefits that come from it. You take part in that. So the supper is to remind us that we have committed ourselves to Christ Jesus. We have said, I'm going to be loyal to him in life. Why? Because he has given me his life. And so we point back to his death while also looking forward to his coming again, all while recognizing that he reigns, and he reigns forever and ever. It's also meant, the supper is meant to strengthen and encourage this assembly of God's chosen people. Paul has already spent quite a while talking about how the church in Corinth was not taking the supper how they ought to have been taking it. And what is the result? You go back to chapter 11 in verse 30. "For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep." So I want to notice a couple of things in context with that phrase. Starting in verse 17 of chapter 11, there's a certain phrase that's repeated about 6 times. And it's the phrase, "come together." Verse 17, 18, 20 uses the phrase "meet together," but it's the same Greek phrase there, 33 through 34. But then, even notice in verses 20 and 21, there's a contrast made here. "Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper." So we have the Lord's Supper put up. This is not what you're doing. Okay, what are you doing? Verse 21. "For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk." So do you see the contrast? There is the Lord's Supper and there is one's own supper. But they think that they're taking the Lord's Supper, don't they? But they're doing it for selfish reasons, for all the wrong reasons they're doing it. And so there are several points that we could make from all of these verses. But I want to make just a couple. The Lord's Supper is not something that we can do by ourselves. We are to take of the supper together as God's people. It's not something that you do on a mountaintop, alone by yourself, getting closer to God in that way. Maybe some of you, we've got some people that like to hike and camp and all those sorts of things, national parks and all that. There's a famous figure when the national parks had not yet come into existence, John Muir. Maybe you've heard of. He's a lot of times called the father of the national parks because he was out there, out west, pioneering and preserving a lot of these places. And I think he was even, I forget which religious connotation he was a part of, but he was a preacher of some sort from some denomination. And he said a lot of things. But one of the things, or one of the more famous things that he said, was, I'd rather be in the mountains thinking about God rather than in church thinking about the mountains. Well, that mentality has carried through even to our day, hasn't it? I've met people that think like that. I can be closer to God in nature than I can, and they refer to the church as just some building. We know that's not what the church is. Maybe that's a lesson for another time. The church is God's people together. And we are here on the first day of the week to think about such good and right and noble things, to partake of the supper together. But going a step further with this, when you partake, where do your thoughts turn to? And I want to be careful with how I phrase this, and I'll continue to elaborate. But do you merely look inward? Do you only look at Christ having died for my sins? It was my sins that put Jesus on the cross and so forth. By the way, true. All true. But I want to suggest that if Paul has spent so much time emphasizing take the supper together, when you meet together, when you come together, you do this together, that this is not just, now we're all of a sudden supposed to isolate ourselves and not think about the other saved in the assembly. I believe that what Paul is also emphasizing is that we are to think about this blood-washed throng of God's people that have been saved by the blood of the Lamb. We read about that before partaking this morning, right? In Revelation chapter 5. The blood of the Lamb. We are the church, the saved ones of God. And so this should be a time of reflection, certainly on my own relationship with Christ, but also recognizing that this is a time to recognize unity with all of God's people in this assembly and also with God's saved ones around the world and throughout time and all that will ever be. To think about that glorious thought. The opposite, going back to verse 30, the opposite of weakness is what? Strength. The opposite of sickness is health. The opposite of sleep is sober mindfulness, being awake. And Paul ties that to not discerning the Lord's body, partaking in an unworthy manner, and I think all of these thoughts are baked into that equation. So when you remember Christ's death, don't only, and I'm not saying throw this out, don't only think about your own sins, but think about all the sins that have been washed away by the blood of Christ. It's not just yours. Marcus talked to us about Elijah on Wednesday. You're not alone. There are 7,000 that have not bowed the knee. There are so many that have been washed by the blood of the Lamb. Matthew 26 and verse 28 even gives us some insight into what Paul is talking about here. Going back to when Jesus first instituted the supper, Matthew 26 and verse 28, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. He has poured his blood out, not for just one, but for many. Let's not forget that. And really tied to that, when we partake together, we are all coming into the presence of God. And I'm already seeing that I don't know what I'm doing with the slides this morning. I'm not sure what happened there, but hopefully you can get a little bit of that, but you can just follow along with the points I'm making if you can't make that out. But when we partake together, we come into the very presence of God. When Paul references back, again, 11 and verse 25, when he references back to Jesus talking about the blood of the covenant, that phrase was to bring something very specific into their minds, not only the apostles, but also future Christians, us today. It should take us back to Exodus 24, when Moses and the elders came into the very presence of God, the glorious presence of God. And in that place, on that day, they had communion. They literally supped in the presence of God. And if we go back, let's just go back and read to get a sense of what happened here. Exodus 24 in verse 7. Then he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient." And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you, according to all these words." Then Moses went up, also Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and it was like the very heavens in its clarity. But on the nobles of the children of Israel he did not lay his hand. So they saw God, and they ate and drank. Now think about this for a moment. There's a thought exercise. Do you get the idea, do you get the picture that Moses and Aaron and his sons and the 70 elders saw this picture and then just said, well, the Lord said to do it, I guess we should do that. We'll go ahead and check that box off and get that done. I think they understood, at least at this moment. We realize there were failures later on. Nadab and Abihu were mentioned here. Leviticus 10 rings in our minds. They missed the picture there. But here, I don't get the sense that they missed what was going on. We don't need to miss it either. We may not have the cloud of presence or a pillar of fire coming down to manifest itself, to manifest the glory and the presence of God. Make no mistake that when we partake of the supper, he is in our midst. And if we can, I think that if we can cement that thought in our minds, then what we're doing at the table will not become rote. It will become more serious, and we can elevate that in our minds. And one other thought with that, to kind of tack on to that point, that when we come into the presence of God for eternity, do you think that that is going to become old? If you think this gets old, do you think that being in God's presence for eternity is going to be old? There are those who would look at passages like Revelation 7, Revelation 21. We've looked at these passages already in our study with Wes. But there are those who would look at passages like that about serving God day and night, and there's some different thoughts about, at least in chapter 7, of is this the perfect heavenly picture yet, or is this paradise? I'm not sure of all those things. There's some good thoughts on either side of it, but I think eternity at least is represented. And there are some who would say service. I thought that heaven was all about what I enjoy, relaxation or football, being on a lazy boy recliner for eternity, whatever it might be, some really shallow thoughts. And maybe that's not you. Maybe you're not to that point. But even if we think about the Lord's Supper as monotonous, old tradition, we're not recognizing what we're doing. We are coming into God's presence. And if we get tired of coming into God's presence now, what makes you think that you're going to enjoy God's presence for eternity? That's something to think about. That's something we need to take to heart. What I want to close with then is this thought of maybe even some things that we should be thinking on. And by the way, what I'm about to present, this is not a comprehensive list. These are just some suggestions for reflection when you yourself are partaking of the supper. But one suggestion I might make is that we need to be preparing our minds ahead of time before partaking of the supper. We talked some months ago about the songs of ascent. That would be Psalm 120 through Psalm 134. And what those psalms were is when the Jewish pilgrims were going up to Jerusalem, because you remember it was a great hill. When they were going up to worship at the temple, they would sing those songs, those psalms. And it was to already bring into their minds, they were worshiping, but it was already to prepare their minds for the worship that they were going to take part in at the temple, the sacrifices and so forth. Does that have any practical application for us today? The night before Sunday, begin to already think about what you're going to think about when you get here in the assembly. Have some scriptures already prepared. This is what I'm going to meditate on. This is what I'm going to think about. Maybe even when you wake up that morning, already start thinking about those things. Listening to some hymns that might put you in the right frame of mind. You may have some different methods yourself that help you prepare your minds for worship. There's not one formula, not one formula that works. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we don't need to just show up to the assembly Sunday morning, spend maybe 10 minutes thinking about the supper, and also not just that, but football season is in full swing. We spent a full day ingesting football or whatever else you're interested in. It doesn't have to be just football. I'm not trying to harp on just that. Your hobby, whatever it is. You spend all day doing that, all week doing your thing at work or school or whatever it might be, and then we expect to just come to the table for maybe 10 minutes to turn that switch on, think about those things, and then we'll turn it off. We need to already be preparing ourselves for what we're doing here, because this is a glorious thing, and it should not be the approach that this is kind of just secondary. This is just one of the many things that I do throughout the week. This is primary. One other thing I'll say is that you participate in the supper. When Ryan reads to us from Revelation chapter 5, are you there with your Bible opened, reading along? Or maybe you're not able to, or maybe you do better just listening. Are you listening intently to those words? Or are you, thinking about lunch, where you're going to go afterwards? Are you thinking about your plans through the week? Thinking about what you have planned at work? Think intently about the words that we sang before the supper. Victory in Jesus. Don't just tune out. Maybe even take those words, and as you're partaking, look back over them. Think more on them. I think that would be worthy. And I want to be careful, we all want to be careful, when we start talking about shortening our service times and so forth, and there's, that's a whole other can of worms. But what I want to suggest is that it should never, 10 minutes at the table. We could do more. We could use more time, certainly. But let's never talk about shortening our time and thinking about the glory and the love and the sacrifice that has been made for us. I think we need to be careful there. One more thing that I'd like to suggest is that maybe to help us not think about the supper as just a sort of rote, monotonous tradition, think more and bask more in the glory of Christ's sacrifice. Maybe you're thinking like that young man that I mentioned at the beginning, where I can only really think of a handful of passages to turn to when talking about the Lord's Supper. And I will also say, maybe that's just where you are in your spiritual walk. Maybe you haven't studied as much yet, but you are continuing to study and you want to learn more. Great. That's good. Here's some suggestions. Again, this is a small sample size. The servant songs of Isaiah are a great place to meditate on. They are rich with language, rich with prophecies, hundreds of years before Christ came, talking about the circumstances of Christ's death, what Christ was thinking about at the cross, and even the motivations and the thoughts of his enemies. It's incredible. Those would be worthy of your time and of your attention. Psalm 22 is another awesome prophecy. And again, these are incredible passages. And you can't go wrong with those. Leviticus 25, for instance, talks about the year of Jubilee when all of the prisoners would be set free. This is referenced later in Isaiah 49, Isaiah 61. Jesus quotes this later in Luke chapter 4. And he says, "This prophecy is now fulfilled in your midst, because I'm the one that sets the prisoners free." Exodus 12, where the Passover is first instituted, the Lord's Supper being a fulfillment of that institution. I've already talked about Exodus 24, when the Old Covenant was first ratified with the people. Hebrews 10, we talked about some of that in our class this morning. A better sacrifice. Even just reflecting on this phrase, as John puts it, John the Baptist in John chapter 1 and verse 29, where he sees Jesus coming up the road, and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Meditate on that. We talked about hymns. There's a great resource in the back of these songbooks that has it cataloged for you rather conveniently, a lot of songs that would pertain to the Lord's Supper. But I'll also make this suggestion. Those aren't the only songs that you can think about with the Lord's Supper. This is not an authoritative thing, that list that they provide. It's helpful. There are even some others that I think we could include in that. Victory in Jesus that we sang this morning. Almighty God beyond the veil. We talked about the veil being torn this morning, where we can now come into the presence of God because of the victory that Jesus accomplished through his death and through his resurrection. Night with ebb and pinion. You can go on and on. Open up those words. Think on them intently. Maybe even, and I know maybe we have this trepidation, I don't know the tune to this song, so it's kind of throwing me off. Just look at the words. There are some beautiful words, some with error, so be careful there, be discerning. But there are some great words, scriptural words, that would be worthy of our thought and of our time. Go to God in prayer with all that you've just read, all that you've sang about with your brethren, that you've taken part in together, and give your gratitude to God for all of it. The Lord's Supper is not just some tradition that we have come up with that is kind of just a time filler. It just fills that 10 minutes or whatever it is for that portion of the service. It is a God-given memorial that helps us to focus our minds on spiritual realities. And I know that many of you have thought about this also. I think there's a lot of wisdom that God, we can see God's wisdom in it being on the first day of the week, because it sets the precedent for the rest of the week, refocuses our minds on what we're about as Christians. Because we may not be in the assembly on Monday. We may not be in the assembly on Thursday, but we should continue to show God gratitude by being loyal to the covenant that was ratified with His blood, and think about the love and the sacrifice that Christ gave in giving up His body for us. Hope those thoughts have been helpful for you all this morning. You may be here this morning and you have not yet entered into that covenant relationship with Christ. There is only one way. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. There is no other way to the Father except through me. And He has shown that way. His apostles have shown that way through their writings. So if you seek to be in that relationship this morning, and you understand that you are a sinner, you understand that there is nothing that you can do by yourself to be redeemed of those sins, but Christ is King, and He does reign because of all that we've talked about, then you can commit yourself to Him in your life this very morning. You can start that relationship by being washed in the waters of baptism, coming up a new creature. Maybe you've broken that covenant, and that can look like a lot of different ways. Maybe you've walked away from the Lord. You can come back this morning, ratify that covenant again. If you have a need, won't you come to the front as we stand and as we sing?